Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, had seen it all. Over his decades of distinguished service to the Roman Republic, the politician and general had led armies across the known world. He triumphed 3 times, an honor earned through leading victorious campaigns from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, while also making time to purge the entire Mediterranean of pirates. As the foremost commander of his day, he had traversed the entire Roman world, making Rome's first contact with new peoples and bringing vast swaths of territory under Roman dominion. An adventurer as much as a general, Pompey would even enter the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, over the strenuous objections of the Jewish priests. The first Roman to subdue the Jews and set foot in their temple by right of conquest was Gnaeus Pompey. Thereafter, it was a matter of common knowledge that there were no representations of the gods within, but that the place was empty, and the secret shrine contained nothing. But over the course of his career, there was one thing that Pompey never knew: defeat. In his previous campaigns, the closest Pompey had come to defeat was against the Marian guerrilla leader Sertorius at the Battle of Lauron. But this was really only a limited setback, and in the decades since, he had swept aside all before him, even overcoming capable commanders such as Mithridates. But the most impressive victory of his career thus far was his win over Caesar at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 58 BCE. This battle between one-time friends and allies could very well have ended the Roman Civil War, but Pompey had been taken aback by Caesar's sudden flight from the field and declined to pursue, fearing a ruse. In reality, he had broken Caesar's army and could have won the war had he acted with resolve. Pompey made a brilliant fight, and at last routed Caesar's whole force and killed 2,000 of them. He did not, however, force his way into their camp with the fugitives, either because he could not, or because he feared to do so, and this led Caesar to say to his friends, "Today, victory would have been with the enemy, if they had had a victor in command." Pompey's track record as a general, combined with his now substantially superior forces, thus made him supremely confident that his next encounter with Caesar would allow him to end the war for good. In the aftermath of the battle, he pursued Caesar further inland, both armies stretching their supply lines, but this favored the more well-stocked Pompeians. Caesar was finally bottled up near Pharsalus, and for days the armies stared one another down, both reluctant to engage, though we know not whether this was cowardice on the part of the commanders, or the last remaining embers of their close friendship manifesting in a hesitance to begin a Roman bloodbath. Eventually, however, Pompey was goaded by the senatorial elites into attacking Caesar, trusting in his skill and his numerical superiority to carry the day for him. The oligarchs were confident. However, the omens were murky, and the day before the battle, Pompey dreamed that as he entered his theater, the people clapped their hands, and that he decorated a temple of Venus Victrix with many spoils. On some accounts he was encouraged, but on others depressed by the dream. He feared lest the race of Caesar, which went back to Venus, was to receive glory and splendor through him. Indeed, it was the negative interpretation that was to be vindicated, as Pompey was abandoned by fortune, and his forces would be utterly routed, his army broken as a cohesive fighting force. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Caesar's army was smaller, but it was better trained and much more disciplined. Caesar had also chosen the battlefield well, utilizing terrain to minimize the impact of Pompey's superior numbers, and hugging a river so that any flanking movement could only come from one direction. He also held a small force in reserve that repulsed Pompey's inevitable cavalry charge, which was made up primarily of inexperienced nobles. Their disorderly retreat crashed back into Pompey's line, opening up gaps that were quickly, brutally, and methodically exploited by Caesar's veteran legions. Morale rapidly collapsed, and cohesion broke within a matter of minutes as panic and self-preservation overtook honor, orders, and duty. Pompey's army was suddenly no more. The disintegration of the army serves as a reminder of why ancient battles tended to be such lopsided affairs. The majority of casualties occurred when armies broke formation, an illustration of the paradox that occurs when soldiers feel that the battle is lost, so abandon formations that provide protection, and instead seek to set out on their own. This is, ironically, what often seals their fate. But, fortunately for Pompey's fleeing legions, Caesar was seeking what he called a new type of victory, one where his mastery and command were reflected not in piles of enemy corpses, but in his clemency and ability to forgive those who had taken up arms against him. This leniency had been central to his approach in dealing with Romans since the start of the war. Pompey announced that he would treat as enemies those who did not take up arms for the government. Caesar gave out that those who were neutral and of neither party would be numbered with his friends. But initially, this more relaxed approach may have even worked against him, as the elite reasoned that it was better to ask for Caesar's forgiveness than declare open opposition to Pompey. However, after the decisive battle of Pharsalus, many of Pompey's senatorial and equestrian supporters would flock to Caesar's banner. Some may still have expected that the previous clemency had all been an act to split the opposition, and that they would be treated as Sulla had treated his foes. But all found welcome relief in Caesar's mercy. Indeed, the only optimate executed in the aftermath of Pharsalus was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a staunch opponent of Caesar who had already surrendered once, and been granted a pardon on the condition that he not take up arms against Caesar again. Mark Antony personally killed him for this breach of faith, not because of his initial opposition to Caesar. The common soldiers that escaped the slaughter also found themselves forgiven by Caesar, and were promptly enlisted in his legions, adding to Caesar's strength for a war that he knew was not yet over. For despite the totality of Caesar's victory, the grandest prize had eluded him. Pompey, the man he most wanted to express his magnanimous clemency towards, had slipped away, and was now on the run. The all-conquering general, the man who even in his advanced age had defeated Caesar at Dyrrhachium, was now a fugitive, traveling with an entourage so small that he didn't even have a slave to remove his shoes or wash his feet. Pompey was not on the run from Caesar's vengeance, but his clemency. He knew that Caesar sought to end the war through reconciliation, but Pompey could not stomach the idea of being Caesar's equal, let alone his subordinate. His pride was too great to abide anything but the praise he felt he was due as the foremost man in the state. In the words of the poet Lucan, "There will be no loyalty between associates in tyranny, and no power will tolerate a partner." Here, again, we must pause to reflect on who the main driver of the civil war was. Caesar is often given the lion's share of the blame for the war that brought so much death and destruction to the Roman world, and it is frequently claimed that it was his own arrogance and ambition which caused him to cross the Rubicon and plunge Rome into civil war, all because he could not accept political marginalization. I've pushed back on this idea before as overly simplistic, but even if we accept the broad strokes of the argument, should the same criteria not be applied to Pompey after Pharsalus? By reconciling and wedding his authority to Caesar's, the conflict would have come to an end overnight. Unlike Caesar, Pompey knew he had no reason to fear for his life, and Caesar's pattern of clemency meant that he need not even fear an end to his political influence. But to Pompey, accustomed as he was to his unquestioned place at the center of Roman politics, any loss of prestige was so unconscionable as to be worth continuing the war indefinitely. So, Pompey ran, and considered his next steps, debating whether to seek refuge in Parthia or to flee to Egypt. Eventually, it was decided that courting Parthian support for a war against Romans was a bridge too far, and Pompey elected to enlist the Egyptians as allies, counting on his strong ties to the region and the personal debt that the pharaoh owed him for securing the kingdom for his father. So, his ragtag band set sail for Egypt, and hoped to reunite with the remainder of his army in Africa after securing Ptolemy's support. Though this appeared the better option, Pompey knew that there were risks in placing his trust in Ptolemy. But he felt he had no choice. The only alternative was peace. The only alternative was accepting forgiveness and an inferior position in Rome. So Pompey headed for the Egyptian shore, and an uncertain fate. After embracing Cornelia, who was bewailing his approaching death, he ordered 2 centurions to go into the boat before him, besides Philip, one of his freedmen, and a servant named Scythes. And, while Achillas was already stretching out his hand to him from the boat, turned towards his wife and son, and repeated the verses of Sophocles. Whatever man upon a tyrant takes his way, his slave he is, even though a freeman, when he goes. After these last words to his friend, he went into the boat, and, since it was a long distance from the trireme to the land, and none of his companions in the boat had any friendly word for him, turning his eyes upon Septimius, he said, "Surely I am not mistaken, and you are an old comrade of mine." Septimius nodded merely, without saying anything to him or showing any friendliness. So then, as there was profound silence again, Pompey took a little roll containing a speech written by him in Greek, which he had prepared for his use in addressing Ptolemy, and began to read in it. Then, as they drew near the shore, Cornelia, together with his friends, stood on the trireme watching with great anxiety for the outcome, and began to take heart when she saw many of the king's people assembling at the landing, as if to give him an honorable welcome. But at this point, while Pompey was clasping the hand of Philip that he might rise to his feet more easily, Septimius, from behind, ran him through the body with his sword. Then Salvius next, and then Achillas drew their daggers and stabbed him, and Pompey, drawing his toga down over his face with both hands, without an act or a word that was unworthy of himself, but with a groan merely, submitted to their blows. This passage from Plutarch is amongst the most evocative sections of all ancient literature, expertly communicating the desperation of Pompey and the lengths to which he was willing to go to preserve his status in the Republic. It also highlights the blinding hypocrisy of Pompey and his faction, as he complains about the tyranny of the Egyptian monarchs and the blow to his prestige he would suffer by asking for aid. For Pompey was not opposed to this tyranny in principle, but the tyranny of others over himself. He did not bemoan the position that the Egyptians found themselves in, but rather despaired that he was now subject to it himself. Had he won the war, we cannot doubt that Pompey would have installed a regime akin to Sulla's, that placed him atop the state as an unrivaled dictator with the power of life and death in his hands. The potential of this prize was so great that he was willing to risk his life in Ptolemy's court, rather than return to Rome in a reduced state. Instead, he died a humiliating death, toga drawn over his face, betrayed, and left to rot under the Egyptian sun. When Caesar arrived days later, he punished those who had cut down the great general, and gave Pompey's head the funeral befitting of a man of his stature. Caesar was willing to forgive his foe, but he could not forgive Pompey's murderers. After all, he was a consul of Rome.